All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's start with the word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study. Be with those that are sick or traveling at this time. We pray that they might be able to be with us at the next appointed time and help us to clear our minds of any distractions we might have so that we can study your word and absorb what we have to learn through your word. In our son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're just going to kind of hit the ground running here. Let's open up to Ruth chapter 4. That's where we're going to begin our study. We're studying the women of the Old Testament, but I think our study of the next women we're going to study needs to begin here in Ruth chapter 4. And I'll tell you right now, it's not going to be Ruth. We're just coming to this book because it's just a jumping off point that I think is appropriate to introduce our study. So Ruth chapter 4, verse 11 is the verse we're going to be looking at briefly. The text says there in verse 11, all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Now, in this verse, as we can see, the author of Ruth is bringing the book to a close by recording a statement from all the people who were in the court and the elders who were present on this occasion in the book of Ruth. The text tells us they are witnesses to what is happening on this occasion, and they're making a request that God make this woman, who is Ruth, she's coming into Boaz's home, and they're making a wish that she might be like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and they also give a wish that Boaz might achieve wealth and become famous in Bethlehem. Now, that in mind, these people and these elders, among other things, are calling to mind these two women who were famous in the history of God's people because they played a pertinent role in building what the text calls the house of Israel. And the house of Israel is just another way of referring to God's people as being a family. And the mothers of this family, that is the house of Israel, were these two women, Rachel and Leah. Now, the reason these two women function as mothers and builders of the house of Israel, it is because it is through them that the collective 12 sons were born, sons which gave rise to the 12 tribes of Israel, and of course the father being Jacob. So those things are what set the stage for the next women we're going to take together in our study of women of the Old Testament. It is these two women, Rachel and Leah. So we're going to be jumping back to the book of Genesis, beginning in chapter 29, to begin our study of these two women. So if you'll be turning with me to Genesis 29, that's where we'll be spending some of our time today. That's Genesis 29. I'll give you guys a second to get there, but beginning in Genesis 29, what we're going to do today is just look briefly into the lives of these two women, Rachel and Leah. Again, we're just going to be looking at some highlights, but we're going to discover for ourselves how God used these two women to give rise to the great nation that was what Ruth 4:11 calls the house of Israel. In other words, what we're going to do today is briefly examine four passages from Genesis 29 and 30 and consider for ourselves 4 points about the relationship that these two women had with each other, and see how God used these ordinary women, flaws and all, to bring about the fulfillment of his promises to their ancestor Abraham that we've discussed before. From the first passage, we'll see simply that Rachel and Leah were sisters. From the second passage, we'll see that Rachel was more beautiful than Leah. We'll talk about that. And from the third passage, we'll see that Rachel was loved more than Leah. And finally, from the fourth passage, we'll see that Rachel was jealous of Leah. Again, we're just looking at the relationship with each other from these four passages. But from these things, some application we'll take from the passages we'll look at is that God used these ordinary women in extraordinary ways. We are ordinary people, but God can still use us to do extraordinary things. Again, that will be some application at the end that we'll see. So we're going to start in verse 16 of chapter 29, if somebody wouldn't mind reading that passage for us. Okay, thank you, Don. So, we're introduced to this individual, first of all, this individual, Laban. He had two children, namely two children that were two daughters. And what are we told about these two daughters? Just what? That's it. Just their names, which one was older and which one was younger. Who was older? Leah. And the younger? Rachel. So we have some information recorded for us here. Now, one reason the author records this information is because these facts that were given, with the one being older and one younger, it becomes important to the story that's being told about these two women later on in the chapter. But all we're seeing here from this verse is simply that Rachel and Leah were sisters. So in this verse, the author has informed his readers that the two daughters of Laban were in fact sisters. And as we've also seen, the author has also given information about who is the older and the younger of the two sisters. And again, the reason for that is because that information becomes important to the story of these two sisters later in the chapter, which is that in verse 26 of this chapter, when this information will come back to, Laban says that to Jacob that it was not customary for the younger sister to be married off before the older of the two. And we're going to discuss that here in just a minute. But for now, we're going to move on to the next verse, verse 17. If somebody wouldn't mind reading that one. You have figure and appearance there? It's good. I have form and face, but it lends to that language. So the point we're going to be looking at here is, what are we told about Rachel and Leah, the differences between them? So you have delicate there? Okay. And what about Rachel? She's beautiful. Now, so there's a contrast being given. Now, the first part of this verse, we're told about Leah. The New American Standard says the eyes were weak, but this does come from a word that carries with it the idea of delicacy. But one reason it's translated as, do you have weak, Matt, in yours? Okay. One reason it's translated as weak in this particular case is because there's being a contrast drawn between Leah and Rachel. Now, with that being the case, since this word can carry a negative or a positive sense, it's uncertain whether the author is describing a positive attribute about Leah's eyes or giving a negative attribute. But given that there's a contrast, there will be a contrast drawn, it seems to be a negative attribute, and that's why this word is translated as weak as opposed to delicate in the New American Standard. So, since the author is doing that, we move on to Rachel. In my translation, I have beautiful of form and face, but you have figure and appearance, Matt. Does anyone else have a different reading? Form and appearance? Okay. So here's where we're seeing the contrast. Now, when we talk about figure and appearance, what does that entail? It's physical attributes that's giving here. Now, the word form, or if you have figure, that's just Rachel's overall physical appearance. But then we have face. What's the face? This part of ourselves, exactly. Just our head and everything in front of it. Now, in this case, it's parallel to form, but this would include Rachel's eyes, and if Leah's eyes were weak, if that's the translation we're going with, Rachel's face was more attractive to look at versus Leah's. This seems to be the picture being painted. So the picture being painted about Rachel is that she was overall an attractive woman. Now we've never seen Rachel. We don't know that anything beyond the description that's given here. But the main characteristic about Rachel given in this verse is the fact that she was beautiful. Now, what does it mean when something is beautiful? Looking very desirable. That's a good way to put it. That's the Hebrew word for this word beautiful has that idea. It's something that brings pleasure to the senses. It's easy to look at. Rachel was a woman that was easy to look at this particular time in history. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from this verse about Rachel and Leah is that Rachel was more beautiful than Leah. So the author has shown that in comparison to Leah, Rachel was more attractive of the two. Since that's true, this is one reason Jacob would be willing to serve Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. That verse 20 indicates would to him be but a few days because of his love for her. Questions or comments on verses 16 or 17? Okay. So now we're going to look at the third point about the relationship between these two women, and we're going to jump down to verse 30. We'll talk a little bit about context, but we're going to zero in on verse 30 if somebody wouldn't mind reading that. All right, thank you, Dean. So, moving forward in their story, first thing we learn here in verse 30 is that Jacob went into Rachel also. And indeed, he loved Rachel more than Leah. Now, as we come to this verse, we have to be reminded a little bit about the context. Now, what brings us to this point is the fact that after Jacob had served Laban for 7 years for Rachel, Laban deceived Jacob and gave him Leah instead of Rachel. We see that earlier in the story. So naturally, Jacob gets upset that he's been deceived. But what ends up happening is that Jacob served Laban an additional 7 years and finally receives Rachel. Again, the reason being that it was customary to marry off the older before the younger. As we've seen, Rachel was the younger of the two. So it's in that context that the author records what he does here, and it's a statement that carries with it the idea that Jacob had relations with Rachel. And that's what that idea of going into means. But it says he had, because he had a greater love for her there in verse 30. And since that's true, we have to understand something about this word loved. Now, in the New Testament, what's the usual word for love? The agape. And what does agape love entail? It's that intellectual love. Now, back in the Old Testament, the word for love has a slightly different idea. The word for love in the Old Testament, at least in most contexts, has the idea of affection for someone. Now, when you have affection for someone, what does that mean? You desire. You desire them. They're very dear to you. That's the Old Testament idea of loved. So, what does it mean that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah? He desired her more. He had a greater affection for her than he did for Leah. Now, that simple fact that's recorded there We have to ask why it's recorded. It's recorded there because this information is also going to be important to the story of the relationship between Rachel and Leah. The fact that Jacob had a greater love or greater affection for Rachel would create some of the problems that existed between Rachel and Leah, especially concerning the birth of their sons. Well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So since Jacob had this greater love for Rachel than he did for Leah, he does what he does. He serves with Laban for another 7 years. Now, in this statement, the author of Genesis is taking his readers' minds back to what we read in verse 27 of this chapter. Verse 27, the text says, "Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service, which you shall serve with me for another 7 years." Now again, Jacob has discovered that he's been deceived by Laban. He confronts him on the issue, and Laban requires Jacob to serve an additional 7 years to receive Rachel as his wife. Now with that in mind, what the author records in this second part of verse 30, it's sort of a summarizing statement, which serves to summarize the fact that Jacob kept to the agreement. In order to have Rachel as his wife, he needed to serve Laban for an additional 7 years. However, if we go back to verse 28, the text tells us Jacob did so and completed her week, the week of Leah, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. So with verse 28 in mind, it seems that Rachel is already his wife, but he still has to serve those 7 years as agreed upon. Questions or comments on verse 30? Yep, took him 14 years to get her. Andrea? Probably. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, they were probably pretty young, because people did get married pretty young at this culture. And yeah, that's kind of where Laban comes in, as he's plays a role in making some of these arrangements. Yeah, that's true. And you see that in Sarah's example. She was up there in her 90s when she had Isaac. So that's also true. Jeremiah makes a good point. But putting all these things together from verse 30, what the author is showing us is that Rachel was loved more than Leah. Jacob had a greater affection for Rachel than he did for Leah. And again, that fact would be the source of the problems between these two women, and the source of the other problems that existed in Jacob's family, which we read about in the later chapters of Genesis. Now, one example of these problems would be that in addition to Rachel, Jacob would also love his sons, Joseph and Benjamin, more than the other 10 sons. Why? Because it was Joseph and Benjamin that were born through Rachel. He loved Rachel more. He's naturally going to love the 2 sons born from her more than the other 10. Now also, from earlier in Genesis, such as in Genesis 25, verse 28, we see that some family members being loved more than others was something that ran in Jacob's family. This was one of their flaws, playing favorites within the family. Now that's something we can assume because it is in Genesis 25, verse 28, that we learn that Jacob's mother, Rebekah, loved Jacob more than she loved her other son, Esau. So this was a problem in the line, playing favorites within the family. But even though all that's the case, it is these people who had an inclination toward preferential treatment that God would use to fulfill his promises to Jacob's grandfather Abraham to make him a great nation. So that brings us into chapter 30, the fourth and final point we're going to look at, and that's verse 1 of chapter 30, where we see that Rachel was jealous of Leah. So if somebody wouldn't mind reading verse 1 of chapter 30 for us. All right, thank you, Sandy. So, the author here is establishing a point that Rachel was jealous of Leah. Why? She was able to bear children. Rachel, at least at this point in her story, was not. Now, again, we need to remember some context. Now, what brings us to this point is that in verses 31 through 35 of chapter 29, we read that when God, the Lord, saw that Leah was unloved by Jacob, what God did was open her womb, in spite of the fact that Rachel was barren. So Leah gives birth to the first four sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. And then at that point, the text says she stopped bearing, and that's Genesis 29, verse 35. So those facts are what bring us into verse 1 of chapter 30. Rachel has seen that her sister Leah has given birth to at least 4 children at this point. She becomes jealous. Sandy's translation has the word envied, which is better than the word jealous. Now, what does it mean to envy someone? That's an open question. That's a way to look at it. Somebody has something that you want, they have it, you don't. Putting it in another way, this word envy or jealous, depending on what you have, it's being envious of the successes of others. Somebody has succeeded in something, you did not, and therefore you're harboring these feelings, negative feelings of envy. You don't want them to have it, you want it for yourself. That's the slight difference between jealousy and envy. Envy is a much stronger form of jealousy. You don't want this other person to succeed, you want to succeed for yourself. Now, applied here, Leah's had 4 children. Rachel had become envious of her sister because Rachel has had none at this point. So what does she say to Jacob? Give me children or else I die. Why would she say that? Especially, that's part of the idea here. There was no point living if she could not have children. That's the mindset that existed at this time. So that's what she says to Jacob. Jacob, give me children or I'm going to die. Now, when she says that, you have to look at Jacob's response in verse 2. The text says, Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Now, what's Jacob saying to Rachel there in response to verse 1? That's probably his mindset. Why? Why would he say something like, What do you expect me to do? What's Jacob's mindset in terms of God? What does he say? That's another part of the idea here. I'm not God. I cannot give you children. Now, yes, he would have to be physically involved in the process, but ultimately it's God. So am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Is it my fault you haven't had children? Say, no. God has withheld from you the fruit of the womb. He has no control. Men, for those of us who have had children, you are not the one in control of your wife having had children. You're not. God is in control of the womb. You can do everything that's physically involved in having children, but even if you do, it's still God that's in control. So we have to jump to verse 3. Rachel comes up with a solution to this apparent problem in her mind. Text says, she said, here's my maid Bilhah, go unto her that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children. So what's Rachel's solution to this problem? That's it. Here, take my maid, Jacob. Have relations with her. Get her pregnant. But her children are going to be mine. Like Sarah. Yeah, the Hagar example. It's the same situation. But all of this stems from this jealousy that Rachel is feeling toward Leah. Goes back to verse 1. Rachel was jealous, or more specifically, envious of Leah. Matt, do you have envious there in verse 1, or is it jealous? Jealous, okay. So, she was jealous, but a better word there would probably be envious of Leah. So the author of Genesis has shown that Rachel had this envious attitude toward her sister Leah. What was the source of that? Leah had children, Rachel did not. Again, at this point in their story. So what does she do? She demands Jacob, give me children or else I die. Jacob says, I'm not God. I'm not the one who has prevented you from having any children. Now also, this envious attitude of Rachel is something that would also carry forward to her sons. When we read the story of Joseph, what's Joseph's relationship with his brothers? How do his brothers feel about Joseph? This is Bible review for you. They're envious of him. Why were they envious of him? He was loved more by their father, in addition to Benjamin. So, that's something we read about in Genesis 37. Also, Joseph had these dreams that his brothers would be bowing down to him. And that creates feelings of envy. But those things, these envy, these loving more than others, these preferential treatment, God uses those things to bring about the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. I was just thinking this morning, as I was thinking about this lesson, that's something, at least in my mind, wonderful about God. God doesn't use us despite our weaknesses. He uses us in spite of our weaknesses and uses those weaknesses to accomplish a greater good. That's what God is doing here with these women. Going back to Ruth 4, verse 11, it's these events in these women's lives that God used to build the house of Israel. Questions or comments on this verse? Okay. So we've looked at 4 points, 4 highlights from about Rachel and Leah. These were ordinary, flawed women, but God used them in extraordinary ways. These were sisters. Rachel is more beautiful than Leah. Rachel is loved more than Leah. Rachel is jealous of Leah. This was part of their relationship with each other. But they were ordinary women. So the application to us is God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From the things we have briefly examined about Rachel and Leah, we see that in spite of their backgrounds, in spite of their weaknesses, God used them to his glory. So we can take encouragement in the fact that even though we are weak and flawed people, God can still use us to carry out his will. Well, how do we know that? We see it all through Scripture. We find people who had their share of weaknesses, King David being one of them. And God used people like that to fulfill his promises to his people. These people were used to further God's purpose of bringing salvation to the world through Jesus. And that's something we have to keep in mind. All these stories that we read about, they're all pointing toward Jesus, about what God would do through him. And so we have to be willing to be used by God so that through us, God might continue to do his will. These are just a few applications from what we've looked at today. Any other questions or comments? All right. Don, would you close us today?